Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome back to another episode of
She Did What?
So this
I love
week,
that we have to look at each other when we say that.
well, we want it to be in sync,
It's
right?
funny.
So this week we're going to finish the second half of a two-part show. If you haven't listened to the first half, you should go back and do that right now. Last week we introduced radical Black feminist and activist Florynce, aka Flo Kennedy. We talked about the first half of her active career fighting both racism and sexism. At a young age, she participated in her first boycotts and sit-ins until she realized she could make more headway in the courtroom. So she decided to study law. She went to Columbia's sister school and then was one of the first Black women to obtain a law degree.
Yeah, so she started her own practice and she took on smaller cases until she became the legal representation for Billie Holiday, as well as Charlie Parker's estate once they died, which catapulted her into the world of entertainment law, and she was responsible for some of the first laws protecting artists and their earnings. And now we take you through her activism, lecturing, and involvement in both the Black Power and women's liberation movements, and most importantly, practicing intersectionality by trying to integrate both movements against the biggest oppressor, a white government.
This is the most active part of Flo's career, so although we have a lot of information for you, we strongly encourage you to check our sources and learn more about this really amazing and super badass woman, including the Flo Kennedy show, which she hosted a little later in her life and which you will hear some of today. So in the last episode, we talked about her early childhood, growing up in the South, moving to New York with her sister, and that brought us up to about 1965. Mm-hmm. So that's where we're going to pick up today.
So in 1965, there was an event that happened, which unfortunately happens to just a lot of Black people in general, unjustified police interaction. So a gas explosion happened in her neighborhood. She was at, the police line saying, "Here's my ID. I need to get in my house." They said no. But what happened was these white men started walking by. "Oh, yeah, John, go ahead." And she, was like, "What the hell is this? This is my house. This is my neighborhood." Was it a bus or like just a bunch of guys that walked through? And so she was like, "Screw this. I'm walking with them." And then she gets manhandled from that group.
Yeah, she gets pulled apart by the police, who didn't believe that she, a middle-aged Black woman, lived in this rather elite white neighborhood.
With an ID.
With an ID, yeah. She lived in this neighborhood, but they didn't believe her. And so what they did was they actually forced her to strip in a squad car, and they made her spread her legs. And then they charged her with obstructing justice, even though she had done absolutely nothing wrong. She was just trying to get to her apartment.
Right.
She was obviously extremely upset, and for good reason. She told her story to as many reporters as would listen to her, and she even threatened to sue the police station for $500,000. And this incident kind of shifted her perspective, and further confirmed what she had intellectually known all along, was that even though she was a well-to-do lawyer living in a nice neighborhood, her Blackness made her a target of oppression.
So she was found guilty on these charges of obstructing justice. She made appeals her whole life, and she ended up dying with a charge of obstructing justice. Like, even though she was a lawyer,
they were the ones obstructing justice.
Right. And so very safe to say this was her pivot. So she slowly started realizing that by being a lawyer and kind of fighting discrimination that way, that it was only one case at a time. Mm-hmm. And we will get back into kind of changing the way she did handle cases when she chose which ones, because it's very interesting. So in 1966, Flo started the Media Workshop. It was during this time that she realized the media is a big problem with discrimination and racism. Mm-hmm. So she fought tirelessly to help racial representation in the media. She went after Benton and Bowles, just one company she went after, for not hiring a fair amount of Black people, considering that their advertisements targeted lower income and Black neighborhoods, communities of color in general, so that they're giving them their money, but there's no people of color actually working there.
Right. There was no representation.
So she helped organize a boycott against the advertising company to hire more people of color. And also she pushed them to hold a fundraiser in the areas that they targeted for advertising, which I think is cool. Because of that, other companies started following Benton and Bowles' lead, even though we shouldn't give them too much credit.
Right.
Because they had to be forced to do it. So not only were, these media companies starting to hire more people of color, although they were at entry-level positions. It's not like they're hiring executives.
Right.
But, progress. She was very critical of the media's portrayal of Black Power movements, which she was becoming more and more involved in following this very traumatic experience. In addition, the portrayal of politicians during their election seasons, as more people of color started running, both men and women, Black men and women. And in a specific instance, the biased coverage of Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who, if you remember, he was one of the first figures that she became aware of when she moved to New York.
So he was, if you don't know who that is, he was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives for New York State. So he'd been elected to that position in 1945, but his seat was up for re-election in the fall of 1966.
So, there's this whole campaign, him against him, because there's not many women in politics yet. And so what happened was all congressmen are corrupt. There's just corruption in politics. And what happened was the media was choosing to exploit Powell Jr.'s, how do you say that? Controversial decisions.
Yeah, well, what it was is that he was accused of, hiring relatives, so some nepotism, and just sort of...
Flo's point being that everyone did that.
Right. And everybody did do it.
Right. So she's like, hey, I'm not saying this isn't true, but, you need to hold everyone responsible if you're going to choose to talk about this.
Yeah. So all congressmen and arguably people in power some of them were putting their family members on payroll, using government funds for vacations. But the reason she thought they were really targeting Powell is because of his involvement on the periphery of the growing Black Power movement. So Powell had hosted a planning meeting for the Black Power conference in a government building with federal guards manning the door. And it was only after that the attacks and the attempts to limit his power really became more serious. And one of the people that attacked Powell was a Democratic congressman from Florida, Sam Gibbons. So Flo, which this is a tactic she had used before, as we were just talking about, she called for boycott of all Florida citrus fruit.
So Flo's attack on the media was just about representation, and we're still fighting this today. She also pointed out the tokenism of Black representation,
which is still something, and maybe this is getting sidetracked, but when you see mainstream films or television shows, there will be one person of color and
as
just
the best friend or the funny one or the gangster.
Right. They're rarely the lead, and there's never more than one person in the group. So now we get to the National Organization of Women. It's an organization that was formed in 1966. Flo attended the first meeting of the New York chapter of NOW. We're just going to call it NOW from now on. Betty Friedan was one of the organization's founders, and she had also written The Feminist Mystique. And she had expressed that she wanted NOW to do for women what the NAACP had done for African Americans. But what she failed to see is that the goals of each of these organizations didn't need to be mutually exclusive.
Right, which we introduced last show, obviously, that was Flo's main thing.
Yeah, intersectionality. Right. That is the most quintessential thing about her activism, really.
The thing about the NOW organization is it was not only created and run by white women, but these white women also blatantly tried to physically silence Flo during the meetings when she would bring up anti-war or Black Power agendas. They did not have any interest in demanding equality for all women, and essentially they were huge hypocrites. This did not stop Flo from expressing her thoughts and ideas during these meetings, however. I mean, we're literally talking. She would be like, sure, but what about, why don't you guys show up for this Black Power movement?
Right.
And then they'll be more inclined to come to your movements. Why are we treating these as separate issues? And this happened in every meeting. Most times she was one of the only Black women. And so, she persisted. She kept raising her hand.
So the first year that the New York chapter was meeting, she was the only Black woman really to show up to meetings consistently, the only Black feminist. And when she would suggest that women should unite against the Vietnam War or protest racism at NBC, she was shut down by the leadership. But what she realized is, and the reason she kept bringing it up, is she realized that by planting the seeds of these thoughts in the minds of feminist activists, they would eventually kind of get that idea. So she would show up at feminist rallies with a briefcase covered in anti-war stickers and hand out information about the Black Power movement as well, hoping that the passion that these young feminists had, the fire that they had, would carry over and sort of spread out into other movements.
Right. she got very involved in the Black Power movements. And it was at the same time, like coinciding with this NOW meetings.
So this is like 1967.
Right. That a Black Power conference was held and organized. And Florynce was a huge part of it. And she was like a keynote speaker.
Yeah. Even though most of the organizers argued the need for Black nationalism, Flo saw the potential of the movement to unite all marginalized people against a common oppressor. So while she was speaking, actually, this is interesting, there was a commotion at the back of the room, and 2 white women had showed up. They were being asked very loudly to leave the conference, to get the hell out. Mm-hmm. Kennedy recognized them as NOW members, T. Grace Atkinson and Peg Brennan, and she had invited them. So the woman who had been loudly asking these 2 white ladies to leave was like, how could you possibly invite white women to this Black Power conference?
Right.
Somebody even, I guess, shouted out in the audience that they should kill Flo for bringing them. And Flo, because she took no shit and was totally a badass, said, do what you have to do. I've lived my life. And those 2 women stayed. But she kept inviting white feminists to Black Power meetings and to going forward.
So she defended her white guests, so they could stay in the conference. They did stay. I think T. Grace stayed, right? Because she becomes a big ally.
Yeah, only one of them stayed.
Obviously, the point is she had brought them in to just start closing the gap between the Black and white agenda. The conference led to more groups led by people of color. And Florynce made the rounds. I mean, she visited probably every organization that was in New York, trying to talk to, more white-led feminist movements about the Black agenda, Black Power movements about it's not even like the Black and white. It's also just against war, against
right,
the imperialism.
Right.
It's just everything,
So even when her white invitees were rebuffed at Black Power meetings, she thought it was a good lesson for them actually to face Black rejection. Because it is something that the opposite happens all the time.
Right.
So she also invited male and female leaders of the Black Power movement to speak at a NOW meeting, a meeting of the New York chapter, which, interesting, it was seen from different perspectives by different people. So there were some notes taken by the person who did their minutes for the meeting, but this woman kind of wrote down, she basically blew off like the speakers. There were a couple different men and then 2 women who were speaking from the Black Power movement. T. Grace Atkinson recounts it in a different way. She says, they did actually seem interested in asking about like what the women's movement wanted. However, one of the men did ask why they wore miniskirts, saying like, is that your uniform? And that the Black Power movement was very focused on what they wore as an expression of their revolutionary ideals. So they did question why the women were wearing miniskirts again, which is not great, but it's a question. So moving forward.
It's also important to know that around this time is when the FBI started to collect surveillance on Flo Kennedy. This doesn't really come to a head. It's not like they came and busted her or anything, but you'll learn that it's actually really important and interesting how much information the FBI was collecting on really all of these civil rights activists. So Flo's surveillance by the FBI started becoming more detailed when she represented H. Rap Brown, who was a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, after his unlawful arrest. H. Rap Brown was accused of inciting a riot in Cambridge, and while he was being officially charged and those were going through, he was flying across state lines, and when he landed, he was arrested for carrying a gun.
But that gun was registered with the airline, and he was just flying home to Louisiana from Maryland. So even though those charges were put in place while he was mid-flight,
right,
they still then arrested him for carrying a gun across state lines.
So Flo defended him in court, pointing out the bias charge, considering he was found not guilty of the original inciting violence charge. So it's like, it's a never-ending pit they put people in. This was also when Flo started to realize that the bail industry was also very biased, not allowing the same access to bonds as white people, and if they did, there was bigger interests. So as you can tell, this is when Flo started losing faith in the judicial system and realized that she got to take it to the streets.
Well, she did still keep it in the courtrooms too, but she was more selective.
Yeah. So the next case, big, controversial case, was when she defended Valerie Solanas, who shot Andy Warhol following a string of events dealing with her work, her writings, and her feeling that time and time again he was taking advantage of her.
So Valerie Solanas had written a really militant feminist book called Scum Manifesto, in which she argued that since society didn't have much of a place for women, that women should overthrow the government, eliminate the monetary system, and start killing men. Solanas blames men for totally ruining the world, says all of them should be killed, that, you know, they would break up male and female couples. It's some pretty radical stuff. It's interesting, when I was looking it up, some scholars have said that perhaps it was a satire, and that the really aggressive way that she talks about like systematically eliminating men might be mirrored on the way that white male oppression systematically silences and eliminates like other people. That's something maybe we could look into in the future. So why did she actually shoot Andy Warhol? Everybody blamed it on her being a man-hating radical feminist, but
Warhol had lost one of her manuscripts. You know, she wrote this thing, sent it to Warhol. He kind of jacked her around a little bit and then was like, oh, I lost it. And then he tried to pull one over on her, quietly taking claim of a playwright that she had written. So after all of these events, she showed up one day. She shot at him 3 times. One of them hit him. Florynce decided to take her case, framing the event as an act of radical feminism against a man who took advantage of women. This whole event upset Betty Friedan, who, if you remember, was one of the white women who
founded NOW, the National Organization of Women,
and had silenced Flo in the past. So she was upset because she didn't want this radical man-hating feminist associated with the movement.
She thought that Solanas' work was like too incendiary and like too aggressive.
Betty Friedan is, you know, I'm realizing her as like one of the moderate white women that's like really dangerous for,
that's,
you know,
not to
equality.
Say, I don't want to say that she did nothing for the feminist movement. Obviously, she was a strong ally of women.
But this is when, like she starts denouncing Flo.
Yeah.
Like personally, you know, which we'll talk about later, why Flo isn't in our history books, blah, blah, blah. During this time, younger women were becoming more radical than, say, the NOW organizations and aligning more with Black Power ideas of fighting violence with violence. This is where Eye for an Eye starts coming in. And Florynce's ally, T. Grace Atkinson, who had been at the Black Power conference, she actually became president of NOW, which was problematic for little Betty Friedan.
Yeah.
So Florynce was becoming the force behind radical feminists. She started aligning herself more with younger women who were more inclined to be intersectional. Mm-hmm. These women organized protests for all kinds of causes, but a major one at this time was the Colgate-Palmolive Company protest, because they wouldn't hire women following, you know, the labor laws of the Industrial Revolution. They said that because they couldn't work more than 8 hours under these labor laws, that they didn't want them working at all. Because, like, what if you have to work overtime? I don't want to get sued.
Right.
So it's just an excuse.
That's like if you get a paper cut and you just cut your hand off because, well, you know.
Exactly. They created a huge spectacle, bringing a wide array of attention to the protests and the demands of workers. They would like throw soap and just made a scene.
Yeah. Flo loved protesting. She was really into it. She says that she thought that it should be fun and it shouldn't be dreary and just like the, you know, quiet chanting and carrying signs. Right. They would sing and carry like brightly colored signs. It was almost sort of theatrical. You can actually watch some videos of her protesting online. They carry these bright signs. There's people in costumes. And she was intentionally loud because she knew that making a spectacle of things would draw more people to see the protest and make it more likely for them to get on the news, which was so smart.
Very, very smart. So this is also the time that the big Miss America protest was happening in 1968. It's mostly known as a white or a feminist protest, I should say. I guess a white feminist protest, because what isn't talked about is the racism that was involved in these
pageants.
I almost said competition. It is kind of a competition against women. Until 2 years after this protest, actually, contestants could, this is, you know, in the registration, could be only of the white race. So during the demonstration, they were throwing feminine products in a trash can because they couldn't get a permit for burning things. So they were throwing fake eyelashes, girdles, curlers, tampons, all of these things that, you know.
And their bras.
And so it was known as the bra burning.
That's the origin of that term.
Right. Because also the media played it up. Right. You know, like there wasn't any burning. And so they're trying to make it seem like these women are crazy.
Some people actually took offense to that term, bra burners. But Flo kind of liked it because she thought it made them sound tougher than they actually were because they hadn't actually burned anything that day. But in the typical theatrical style of protest that she loved, they were carrying signs that said, "Can makeup cover the wounds of our oppressor?" and "Welcome to the Miss America cattle auction." They also crowned a sheep Miss America outside of the building. And they denounced the entire thing as being demeaning and reinforcing patriarchal stereotypes and identities that were forced on women to be beautiful and soft and parade around for male attention. And obviously, this is still a problem.
But now white and black women can be objectified on stage.
Yeah. Equality.
Right. So in 1969... T. Grace Atkinson was the first person to formally leave the organization, like with a letter of resignation stating that she didn't agree with the way they were doing things. And Florynce left shortly after that. They both disagreed with the lack of progress beyond a white feminist agenda. I think there's something to be said about them disagreeing with the modesty that tended to be apparent in this group. Florynce was always criticized for her outfits, and they were constantly trying to be silenced for their ideas and about intersectionality. And obviously Florynce had always been silenced, but now she had an ally in T. Grace Atkinson.
Exactly. So they sort of struck out on their own and persisted. And in the way that Flo used to host big parties at her apartment when she was in her law school days, trying to build what is she called an old white boy network.
Oh, yeah.
They continued to host people at her apartment, but rather than full of men, they were full of radical young feminists and other community organizers. So Flo and T. Grace really launched the new women's liberation movement from her apartment.
Yeah.
And we should talk, because you mentioned Florynce's outfits.
Right.
You can't see any photos that we have of her, but you should look her up. She did have a very distinct and unique style all her own. She was really into wearing cowboy hats and little vests and stuff that she would have covered in buttons, like anti-war and whatever, protest buttons. And she often carried a briefcase full of flyers and stuff like that to hand out.
She was just ready to go, man.
Yeah, she was. And she was, I guess her signature thing is that she had really long red painted fingernails. Mm-hmm. She was just really colorful and... Right. She dressed differently than a lot of the other feminists did at that time because she was an older woman at this point. But she didn't, wear muted colors and business skirts. Even in court, she would wear pantsuits, which separated her from the rest of the women practicing at that time. Definitely.
What comes up next is a very interesting event, and it's going to, be pretty inclusive of all movements, black and white movements. This is the Abramowitz versus Lefkowitz case. This event is terribly important for women's rights. This trial was the first to include testimonies of women who had had legal abortions. Before this, only physicians were able to comment on these abortions, which were usually men.
Yeah, and this tactic of using women to give firsthand accounts of their own experiences was utilized a few years later in the 1973 Roe v. Wade case.
So during this case, there were a few instances of Flo actually arguing with the judge respectfully. They have some of the court minutes, and you can read it, and it's kind of interesting. So not only did the judge he tried to silence the women that wanted to come and speak about their abortions. And there's a very interesting conversation between the judge and Flo because he's saying it's not appropriate and Flo's saying it's unfortunate that you don't think the accounts of these women are important in a case about the accounts of these women kind of thing. And in addition to this, he also commented on the way that she dressed. She was one of the few women up until this point who chose to wear pantsuits in the courtroom, and he commented on it, and she had a rebuttal. Also, one of the few women in courtrooms, because there weren't that many women lawyers at this point, female lawyers. She organized protests outside of the courtroom during the trial because she had pointed out before that we talked about that it didn't matter what happened in the courtroom. She realized if nobody knew about it, even if there was progress, it wasn't going to get talked about.
Right.
So she invited the media in, had protests, made sure that it couldn't get silenced. And this is when her and Black Power came head to head once again, as the movement was criticizing birth control as a Black genocide, stating that they want to give Black women birth control to control the Black population. Keep in mind that the heads of the Black movements were almost always men, and Flo argued that there indeed was a Black genocide. Her take on it was that Black adult women were the victims because they were the ones dying from legal abortions.
Yeah, and she argued that having access to birth control and to safe legal abortion gave Black women more agency to be in control of their own bodies, you know.
So also what was happening during this time, you know, Flo reaching out through the media, they went on this radio station to criticize a 1965 report called The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, written by a white man in government, which was extremely racist. It was a white man trying to kind of explain why Black people were poor without claiming accountability of racism, and that he was literally one of the people that did so.
Yeah.
The book points out or calls out that the matriarchal structure that can happen in Black families, this is according to the text, hinders them from excelling socially and politically. Again, the report is very racist.
Yeah, and what they fail to notice is that if there are families where the men in the family are not present, it's probably because they've been arrested on some ridiculous charge.
Right. Or killed.
Yeah.
It was immediately attacked by the Black community as patronizing, racist, the cultural bias involved. And although it seemed like he was trying to get white people to understand that by not giving Black people jobs, that they were more inclined to be poor, literally just kind of blaming Black women, Black strong mothers who took control of their families as being the problem.
Yeah. Blaming people for their own oppression. Oy vey.
So Flo discussed how it wasn't about Black women not having children, the idea of birth control, but giving, you know, Black women the chance to become educated first. She went on to say that it wasn't very realistic for a Black family to be able to support a large family anyways, considering the chances of being well off, especially if you're an activist, was not very likely for a Black family, especially during this time. I think of it as, you know, her pushing women to wait until they get a college degree to have a family, and that the less children you have, the less mouths you have to feed. It's kind of, again, like that now with all people. The Black Power movement was unfortunately very gender conforming, according to Flo's remarks of visiting meetings where women don't share their thoughts and ideas. You brought this up earlier when men were like, why are you wearing mini skirts? So this is also a time where she went after the Catholic Church because, you know, during these cases of abortion, the Catholic Church was putting money into politics to try to get legislation passed that prevented abortions, which she rightfully argued meant that they should not get the tax breaks.
Right.
Because they're involved in politics.
Yeah. If there's a separation of church and state,
still
you got to
happening
keep
to this
that
day.
separation. Absolutely. So after this case, she and Diane Schulder, another feminist activist, published some of the testimonies of the 300 women who had been part of that New York case in a book called Abortion Rap. This was in 1971. Most of them were from women who had suffered from botched back alley abortions. They had people talking about the women who had died from these kind of things. And some of them gave testimony not in the court, but actually just to Flo in her apartment. And she didn't list their names because she wanted to protect them from retribution by their employers or other people in their community or their families. So some of them were anonymous, but she just published firsthand accounts of what had happened before restrictive abortion laws were repealed.
Obviously, Flo was spending a lot of time back in the courtroom, taking on very important cases. It was H. Rap Brown, then Valerie Solanas, then the abortion cases, and she came back for the Black Power movements. They were gaining attention from supporters. It was also gaining more and more surveillance from the FBI, as we mentioned. Members were being illegally stopped in their cars. Their homes were raided. They were being arrested randomly. And in the end, they were trying to intimidate these people and get them off the streets, as again we mentioned.
Some people were killed as well.
Oh, a lot of people were killed. Forgetting that Black people have been treated this way their whole lives and have been inconvenienced at the hands of white men and women, they're ready to fight back. It's kind of, they think that just because it's getting worse that they'll stop. And if anything, it's just giving them more incentive.
Absolutely, to defend themselves.
Right. She spent a lot of time defending these people. She was putting the media on blast during these trials, calling out the increasingly obvious injustices towards civil rights activists brought in on trial. Because again, as the activism and movements became stronger, more people were being imprisoned. She called the media press pigs. We see this now in the coverage of Black Lives Matter movements, obviously.
Right.
She also directly criticized President Hoover publicly for the misuse of funds. So what was happening is the administration was shoveling money into the FBI to survey all of these activists. But this is also during the time that drugs were being introduced heavily into this country during the time of Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And that, this drug problem that eventually happened that they all saw happening slowly could have been prevented. So several members of these accused activists not only were given an enormous bail amount, furthering Flo's realization of this bias, but often they were put into solitary confinement during the trial, which for women as well as men, it was just very dangerous because there's no witnesses.
Right.
A lot of activists have come out talking about all the rape that happens because it's intimidation.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Flo wasn't successful in all of these cases, as we know, seeing that a lot of these activists are in jail still or have died in jail.
And we're talking about all, specifically Black Panthers.
Right.
And
for example, H. Rap Brown, although he was found innocent in those one cases, they eventually put him in. They found something that they could charge him on, and he was in jail. He died in jail within the past few years. This happened with a lot of people.
So in addition to what she was doing with the Black Power movements and defending Black Panthers, she was also working on the women's liberation movement. So right around this time in the early 70s, she met Gloria Steinem, which is a name you're probably very familiar with. Steinem first saw Flo on a television show talking frankly about women's sexual experiences. She said she'd never really heard women talk in public about sex in a truthful way. So she called up the station to find out more about these ladies. And she was particularly interested in Flo's sort of brazen, say what she thinks kind of way of dealing with things. So the two of them became friends. And Steinem, who had been on the lecturing circuit at universities across the country, her partner, Dorothy Pittman Hughes, who was an African-American woman, she became pregnant in 1970, and Flo agreed to fill in for her on the lecture circuit because they really wanted it to be inclusive and give multiple viewpoints. Because Flo was a lot older than Steinem and had been in the feminist movement for longer, she brought really a new dimension to their lectures, especially because she continued to push for intersectionality and cooperation between different movements, which had been sort of pushed to the background, at least in the way the media was covering second wave feminism.
So in 1971, the 26th Amendment was passed, allowing 18 and 20-year-olds to vote for the first time, which introduced 11 people.
11 million people.
Which introduced 11 million people into politics. Flo was inspired by these young activists during her meetings and parties at her house, which we had mentioned. And they seemed to be more radical than the Now members who refused to embrace progress and inclusiveness and what they were fighting for. This is when Flo, in addition to Shirley Chisholm, created the Feminist Party.
So Chisholm had been an early member of Now, and feminist support from that group and others had actually helped her to become the first Black woman elected to Congress. Flo's Feminist Party supported her running as a Democratic candidate in the 1972 presidential election. She went up against George McGovern for the nomination. And the Feminist Party also helped mobilize and get women down to the 1972 Democratic National Convention being held in Miami. So for comparison, in 1968, just 16% of the delegates that were there were women. And in the 1972 convention, 40% of the attendees were women, and that had been largely in part helped by this feminist party. They also helped form the National Women's Political Caucus to handle women's issues in politics and bring more of them to the forefront of media.
Again, Kennedy was on the front lines of the campaign, trying to help with the nomination, using every avenue she knew, and was extremely critical of the media, again, on their one-sided coverage of Chisholm's candidacy.
Basically, most of the focus was on George McGovern.
Right.
As a white man. So this is also when, unfortunately, Flo starts to get sort of pushed out of the mainstream feminist movement because of her tendency to consistently bring up larger issues of oppression beyond just the narrow band of white feminist issues. She was labeled as being like kind of reactionary and like too out there and drawing attention away from what their intended message was.
Right. So I have absolutely no problem saying that this is not a coincidence, that the closer she got to putting Black representation, God forbid a woman, in politics, a Black woman, she was, silenced in the media, right? And
she was sort of silenced in the feminist movement as well,
right,
because she was also an older woman. And, by this point, she's in her late 50s, early 60s, and the feminist movement had sort of traded in these like really young and beautiful and slender, like whatever.
Gloria Steinem types.
Yeah, exactly.
What's interesting and really, really, really admirable about Flo is that this is around the time that she was kind of butting heads with every movement because she was really fed up with the exclusiveness of all of them. So she was obviously criticizing white feminist movements for not incorporating Black women. They refused to talk about the war. They were just very specific about their agenda. She was critical of the Black Power movements for not criticizing the war as much, and also for being a male-led group. And they really did oftentimes silence women because they were about their agenda of Black men entering the field. Yeah, Black women had their place for sure, but they were almost like pulled in between two movements.
Yeah. Flo was a leader of
right,
like a Black feminist movement for sure. But again, overall and throughout her life, what she stressed more than anything was intersectionality. We are all dealing with the same oppressor.
And at the end of the day, if you can't help each other, what's the point?
Right.
Just because the white woman movement changes things doesn't mean it's any better for Black people.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's the same thing now.
Right.
As long as one group is being oppressed or marginalized, then nobody's free.
Right. Flo passed away in 2000 in New York
at the age of 84.
Right. Following, on paper it was because of these injuries that we had talked about that she dealt with her whole life. She lived a long life.
She packed a lot into it, right, too.
She had the Flo Kennedy show following the height of the civil rights movements. She just kept solidifying her ideas of having everyone's voices heard.
Yeah, she never gave up on activism or protesting. She was super into it, and you can actually watch that show. We might have mentioned it in the first one, but it bears repeating. If you go to archive.org, you can watch there's like 200 episodes of the Flo Kennedy show, which was on through the 80s and early 90s. It's very interesting. She's quite a character. Mm-hmm. Why are we covering her? Why did we bring her up to you at all?
Because she's amazing. As we mentioned in the beginning, the only reason we know much about her at all is because of Cherie Randolph. Cherie went to her family, and her family told her that a lot of her documents had been destroyed with the fear that it would be too vulnerable in the wrong hands, considering how many Black Power members were murdered or incarcerated. Cherie also describes that, so why I mentioned the FBI surveillance, is they had roughly like 3 decades of information on her. And that's actually how Cherie really found out about things like her clothing and her hairstyles and very specific things because they took very detailed records. Again, why are these resources being used to categorize everything about these activists?
And also, in a 60 Minutes interview, I couldn't actually find the year that this happened, but a former vice president of NOW, this woman named Lucy Commissar, she dismissed Flo's involvement with the women's movement and with their organization because what she said is that Flo had been focused on Black power and workers' rights and LGBT rights and sex worker rights. She was later in her life. And so she wasn't really counted as being like an early leader in this movement, which to me personally, complete bullshit. Let me just say that. I don't know if it's because they thought she was, they claim that she was like too performative in the way that she protested. And I don't know if maybe they were embarrassed by that or something, but she did a lot to draw attention and fought a lot of really intense court cases to bring attention to these things that were in the darkness. So.
Right. So she was one of the main lawyers, again, just reiterating all of the great things that she did that nobody talks about. She was involved in making the first legislations of abortion being legal. She helped shape protection for entertainers against the monopoly and the cheating industry. She helped the first Black woman run for a presidential nomination. And she also was very, very important in helping all of these, young women become aware and socially involved. Young women are also very aware of the moderacy. So, keep in mind that these older women that had, again, organized now, they were still older white women.
Mostly, yeah.
Right. And so these women being brought up in the 70s, which is a very colorful and more open time in general, saw Flo as their role model, you know. So those are just a couple of the things that she did. She did a lot more really important stuff.
Yeah. So, and we highly recommend that you, again, look up Cherie M. Randolph's book, Florynce, Flo Kennedy, The Life of a Black Radical Feminist, Black Feminist Radical. It came out actually just fairly recently in 2015.
Right.
So you should definitely check it out.
Yeah. And check out the show. Well, we're going to play some excerpts of it right now. So enjoy that. Check them out. And thanks for listening.
Thank you so
learning about
much.
Flo. This episode was written and engineered by Amanda Font and me, Megan Maurer. Thank you again to Azua for providing our theme music. And,
We'll see you next time.
check it out for the next woman.
Fight the power.
Fight the power. Smash the patriarchy.
1, 2, 3. Speak softly, darling.
Hi, y'all. Flo Kennedy here, and I'm here with Elena Steinberg Cobb. She just got an award from us, Backpack, which is sort of family stuff, insider award from one to another. But she is here just because she's great and she's a celebrity. And we tried to think what to put on as her credit. We thought we'd put a theater owner, and she is. We thought we'd put an arranger, which she is. We thought we'd put a composer, which she is. We thought we'd put a poet. I have a poem of hers stuck down here where you can't see it because Don won't let me put anything on the table. And she's everything. And she is, in addition to all of that, a mom with one child who's okay and another one who behaves the way she wants to, which means she pulls her mommy's hair and isn't that great, but we're going to make her civilized whether or not she has a birthday coming up. We'll tell you more about that. Anyway, my guest is Elena Steinberg. You will be seeing her because she's also a video producer, and we'll do a lot of reciprocal stuff. Okay, Elena, what can we tell them that is worth telling?
Well, I think I started out producing records
Right.
and watching a lot of...
That's before Jimmy Cobb or after Jimmy Cobb?
Before Jimmy Cobb,
Uh-huh.
for about 10 or 12 years.
Really?
And I produced some very interesting records with David Liebman and Look Out for Him.
Oh, that's right. David Steinberg called you.
Oh, he did?
I had a message from Jimmy when I was talking to Jamie. I forgot to tell you, but I would have remembered.
Good.
I'm
Well,
sure. Okay, anyway.
And I was very lucky to be on the road with such great
Miles Davis.
musicians as Elvin Jones, I was going to say, and Miles Davis. And I watched a lot of marvelous music. And when Jimmy and I went into the studio to do his own record, we decided to bring in some cameras and make a television presentation of this idiom of music, which is jazz, which I found was always done in a very sort of rush fashion and a very low budget,
Right.
and was never given the packaging
And the
to
respect,
bring in,
really.
and absolutely the respect, and the money wasn't spent on it, basically.
Tell about the one that I'm so crazy about, so nobody else can hear
Right.
it.
So we did a television special, and we got a very fine rhythm section. Jimmy with Walter Booker, who played for a long time
Big
with Cannonball Adderley.
Big name.
And Larry Willis, who worked with Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And Freddie Hubbard, who we don't have to
Big
speak for
names,
himself.
big names.
And Bill Cosby
Oh yes, I thought he was really good. That was
came
really
for a
good.
visit, and we featured Gregory Hines singing.
That's right.
and
That's
dancing.
right. That's right.
And so we made sort of a music.
How many minutes
special.
is that, Elena?
It's a half an hour.
It is 28
Yeah.
minutes. Uh-huh.
And it's beyond the music, we had a painter, Eugene Gregan, Sumi, Japanese painting, who painted portraits of the musicians while they were
You're kidding.
playing.
I
So
didn't realize
the whole
that.
record was sort of a making of
Tour
the
de
music.
force for a lot of art.
Right. And ultimately, we married a tape of another artist, Isaac Abrams, who did airbrush and animated airbrushing, and we made a collage of visual as well as the music, and the music was the point rather than in.
What is it that I saw on the video when I was at your house in Woodstock? Elena lives at the top of a very big hill in Woodstock.
Right.
And today, tell what happened when you saw Serena today.
Well, as I was about to come to town, my one daughter managed to lock my keys in the car.
Yes, she's
So
a
that
5.5
took me an
year old.
extra 2 hours to get down
Right.
the mountain. And then when I got down the mountain, I saw these 3 little children running through this pouring rainstorm with no shoes and hair flying wild.
Wet to
and
the skin.
completely drenched. And the little one looked vaguely familiar.
Like one of your kids,
There was my oldest daughter.
8 years old.
Right.
And she was
Soaked.
there. What did she say?
So I rolled the window down and she said, "Mom, give me money." I was like,
Did you give her?
Yeah. I figured they needed some soup, something warm.